Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. That's going to be a problem. Hello, and welcome to Applicata Biblia. My name is Mark, and as you could tell from the reading, we're going to be studying about Pharaoh today. Okay, so where did we leave off? That's the question. Well, we left off with a character, a young man, who basically saves Israel. In that, well, God saves him actually. That's the providence of God, and this is what we see throughout the scriptures. And Joseph is a very faithful servant of God, and he's given away, he's sold to an Egyptian official. Now, in the short story is he becomes very powerful with Pharaoh because he interprets one of Pharaoh's dreams, and he gives some insight to the Pharaoh on how he can become very mighty in the region. And they do. They actually become very strong because they store up their grain for a period of 7 years. And then there's a 7-year famine in the land, and people have to come to them. And so God blesses Egypt, and we see Jacob and the family moving into Egypt. It's kind of the northeast part of the territory. And they're given land to settle, called Goshen. Now, it's important to know that at that point, they are very much wanted, right? The Pharaoh at that time really does like the fact that here's Joseph, and he can bring his family and settle them. And so what happens? Well, let's read about that, and then we'll get into it. We're going to read from Exodus chapter 1, starting at verse 8, and we're going to read through the chapter. Exodus chapter 1, starting at verse 8. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. That's going to be a problem. He said to his people, "Behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, or else they will multiply. And in the event of war, they will also join themselves to those who hate us and fight against us and depart from the land." So they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor, and they built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread out, so that they were in dread of the sons of Israel. The Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to labor rigorously, and they made their lives bitter with hard labor in mortar and bricks and all kinds of labor in the field, all their labors which they rigorously imposed on them. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives. One of them was named Shiphrah, and the other was named Puah. And he said, "When you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth and to see them on their birth stool, if there is a son, you shall put him to death. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live." But the midwives feared God. That's a good sign. And did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them, but let the boys live. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this thing and let the boys live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are very vigorous and give birth before the midwife can get to them." So basically, we can't get to the kids. So God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very mighty. Because the midwives feared God, he established households for them. That's how God works. That's the way he rolls, baby. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive. So we're going to get into that part of the story in the next one of these studies. Okay, so what happened here? Well, this is a period of about 200 years, 215 years. And obviously, just as we read, Israel is just getting stronger and stronger. And by stronger, what I mean is their numbers are just multiplying. And these pharaohs are starting to worry about it. Now, in the beginning, obviously, the pharaohs knew who the Israelites were. They knew that Joseph helped them, so they felt a debt to them, right? Well, not anymore. How quickly the memory goes when you want to get your own way. They fear the fact that, Israel has so many numbers. Any enemy can come along and maybe sway them to help them to conquer them, and they don't like that. So they put the people in bondage and they make them work. And obviously, this is a thing where you either work or you're dead. And this is the way they're being treated. And so they are obviously, Israel is very much under the thumb of Egypt. And the only reason why I want to bring this up, it's important to see how things are starting to play out. When we left off with Joseph, what was going on with Israel? Well, they were still a clan, okay? Remember in the last one I talked about how moving forward, we're going to see Israel not as a clan, but as a nation. Now, I want to get into the history just a little bit. I kind of need to back up a little bit. Let's look at that history. Genesis is about the building of the nation of Israel. We see man falling away from God, doing all these stupid things constantly, moving away from God constantly. God destroys the earth with the flood. And then mankind moves away from God again in the Tower of Babel. And so God confuses the language. And then we see Abraham. We see Abraham separated out and God making promises to him. And moving forward, this is going to be Israel and how God is going to bring the Christ. Okay? So that's the important thing to understand here. Genesis covers a lot of territory, a lot of time. And I'll put up a timeline so we can see just how much time relative to here moving forward is covered. And so we can take a look at that and see that Genesis actually covers much more time than the rest of the Old Testament does. But the Old Testament, after Moses, is really centered on this nation that God has built. And so it's just important to see that moving from this time forward. When we get to Numbers, the fighting men only are counted at over 600,000 strong. So we can see that the nation is very strong. They eventually reduced the age for fighting to about 20 years old. So all the fighting men, 20 years and older, 600,000 strong. Now that is very much in the future. We're going to talk about the issues that Israel will project when it comes to their faith in God. And I always try to make this clear whenever I'm teaching a class. God is not showing us the issues that Israel has with him so that we can ridicule or condemn or criticize Israel. No, he's showing the issues because that's the issues that you have with him, and those are the issues that I have with him, and that's why Jesus had to die on the cross. I say that every week. Jesus died on the cross, and that's the thing we have to focus on, is our inadequacies before God. And when we understand that, then we can begin to approach Jesus and God's throne correctly. Okay, so just to go over some of these questions, and if you want to copy of these. I'll give you a link to all. I've got 2 books up there now, and this is book 2, right? So we got through Genesis. That's book 1. Book 2 starts with Exodus, which, with Moses. So here is the second dispensation of God. He's going to work this through Moses. We're not there yet, but God is going to dispense his wishes to mankind through the Israelites moving forward. And he's going to give Moses this law, and he's going to dictate to them a lot of different things, including, what you can even eat, and, how to keep the Sabbath holy, and do all these different things. But this is the very beginning of that part of their life moving forward. So what are some of the things that we can look at here? First and foremost, we have to remember that Pharaoh is the guy right now. For this story, Pharaoh is the center of the story that I want to show my students. The idea that here is a guy, and we have to understand the thinking of the culture, not just of Pharaoh. The culture believes, and this is true, right, that kings and world leaders are agents of God. Now, you might look around and say, well, really? So there's a lot of bad things going on in government. There are always bad things going on in government. That's what mankind does. And I'm not excluding that to just men, right? Men and women leaders can be evil. But if they're in a government, they are agents of God. And what I mean by that is they may not even believe in God, but they are answering to God someday. And God expects them to be just. God expects them to understand who He is, whether they like it or not. And during this day and time, the pharaohs and all the leaders, even the kings of Judah later on, are believed to be equal with God. Now, I'm not saying that Israel thought that their kings were equal with God, but all of the other cultures looked to the gods of other cultures as the leaders who the kings worked with. And by this time, or maybe a little bit later, I don't know, but for sure, but at some point, the Egyptians feel like and attribute their pharaohs to be gods themselves. And this is important to understand. They feel like this is a guy who deals with God. This is a guy who deals with the panoply of idols that we have here in Egypt. The idol of the sun, the idol of the rain, the idol of the thunder god, the idol of the god of flies and dung and everything. They have gods for everything. This is something to understand later, and we'll talk about that later. When God comes down with the plagues, you probably remember the story of the 10 plagues. That was God handling the Egyptian gods. So this is important for us to get in our heads, all right? This isn't 2024, right? There's a lot of superstition going on during these days and people worshiping other gods. Okay, so that's important to get into the story first and foremost. This is the culture, and all cultures, they have gods that they worship, and when you go to war, your God goes before you when you're fighting this other people, this other army, and it's a battle of gods, not just of people. Okay, so there's a few other questions I just want to get out there really quick. What is Pharaoh afraid of, and what is his plan? Well, the plan was, and I'm assuming that this is probably for several generations, where the Israelites, before they get too big, are oppressed, and they're oppressed with the existential. It's an existential threat. You either build these bricks, you either grow these crops, you pay X amount of big taxes, or you're dead. That's the way it worked. and they were made slaves to Egypt so that they would not ever think about going to war with them. That was the big fear. So I asked the question, and this is a good question. If the providence of God was for Joseph and Israel to become mighty, and it happened, couldn't his providence cover Pharaoh so that Pharaoh would come to know him? Doesn't God want all people to know him? Well, of course. Of course. That's absolutely right. God does want all people to know him. And here's the rub. We're going to see, as I alluded to, God will make sure that Pharaoh knows who he is. And we'll talk about that when it's time, when we talk about Moses. God's going to make sure Pharaoh knows and all of Egypt knows who Jehovah God is. Before this is all said and done, they will know who he is. And unfortunately for them, because they were so steeped in this idolatry against Jehovah God, God has to take a heavy hand on them. And we'll get into that. So here's a big question you might be thinking, well, if Israel is so mighty, right, if they're getting so big, why don't they just take up arms and kill the Egyptians, right? If there's 600,000 fighting men by the time you get to Numbers, right, and they actually count the people, if there's 600,000, why don't they just fight the Egyptians and get it over with, right? It seems simple in our minds, right? Well, that's because you don't know anything, and I don't know anything. What do I know about being oppressed and being made a slave? We need to understand a few things. When you are being ruled like this, you can't make metal tools. You can't make swords. You can't train to fight. These guys were slaves, and it becomes an issue for them later, and we'll talk about that. When they actually finally do leave Egypt, they still have the slave mentality, and they don't have faith in God. They have a faith in God. It's a working faith, but it isn't the faith that God expects, and we'll get into that. But they are so entrenched into this slave mentality that they don't take up arms, and they just do what they're told because they're so stuck. And this happens to us all the time, doesn't it? We get a job and we get stuck and we feel like we're stuck in the job. We want to leave the job, but if we leave the job, maybe we won't get paid enough, and maybe there's going to be these issues where I won't be able to eat, I can't feed my family or whatever. This is very much what's going on with Israel. And the Pharaohs did a really good job of getting them into that position of subjection. Yeah, if you're not in subjection to us, you're not going to eat. Remember when you came here and ate, now you get to pay for it. It's basically the way it came down. And then the other questions, did the midwives lie? Well, they did lie. They didn't tell the truth. You know, I don't know what to say about that. And God rewards them for not killing the children, not for lying. Okay, just so we can get that clear. God doesn't like it when we lie. And this doesn't give us an occasion to say, see, it's okay to lie. It's not okay to lie. Honesty is what God really prefers in his children. This was an existential case, and he did lie. I mean, these women didn't tell the truth. Or maybe, for all I know, maybe they actually waited too long on purpose. I don't know what they did. But from the looks of it, they lied. But God is not rewarding the lie. He's rewarding the fact that they feared him more than they feared dying by the hand of Pharaoh. And this is something we have to really make clear. Even though they don't, because they don't kill the children, Pharaoh could have said, oh, well, you made an excuse, but I don't care. You're dead. And he could have killed them right on the spot if that's what he wanted to do. Of course, that might have made things worse for him. And more than likely, yeah. So we have to understand we have to be able to parse these things out instead of trying to make an accusation against God, that sort of thing. So this is something I give my students to think about. If Pharaoh's power and wealth did nothing to stop his fears, he was still afraid, right? His power it didn't do anything. He was still afraid of Israel. If he knew God, would he have been so afraid of Israel? Why or why not? Well, of course not. If he knew who God was. See, the statement I opened the statement, this whole lesson with, they forgot who Joseph was. But what does that mean? Well, what that means is they forgot who Jehovah is. And when they forgot who Jehovah is, that's when they went down, they started going south. Oh, no, I'm afraid of these people. If they knew who Jehovah God is, who saved them from being starved, during those 7 years of little, they would have done well. But that's not the way the story plays out. Okay. So what does this say about my relationship with God? Well, of course, it's better to understand who God is. Ultimately, he's the provider of everything, and always remember that. Yes? Yeah, wouldn't you say? And more importantly, and this is what we do every week when we take the Lord's Supper, is remember who we are before God. And remember that he put his son on the cross. I bring that up every time because that is the main point of this. He put his son on the cross. And what I mean by that, he didn't do it. He let evil men do it. But he allowed that to happen so that Jesus would be that sacrifice for us, so that we can be forgiven of our sins. Now, unless you understand, all of the reasoning behind sacrifices, you probably hear that and you go, what are you talking about? What do I got to sacrifice for? Well, you have to understand the reasons for sacrifice. And if you ever want to understand that, I'd just say read through Leviticus and you'll get into that. Okay, so that's just how I wanted to start this section. This is book 2. And just by way of an explanation, I've been gone for a few weeks because I teach another class on Sunday. And it became a thing where the finishing time was compressed. So I had to, I always do my base studies, and then I do my deep studies a couple of weeks ahead of time. Well, I had to compress all of that study into a couple of weeks so I can get so far ahead that I can get this class done in probably about a third of the time. I think we've got a really great class, and people love to give their perspective on what they see, and that's how we learn from one another, right? We're like the Bereans in that sense. We search the scriptures, and we talk about different things of our Christianity and that sort of thing. And so, we might study a chapter, and it might take 3 weeks to do, and now I'm compressing it down to 1 a week. So that's why I was gone, but I'm back, and I'm going to make several of these videos, and I'll be getting these out in the coming weeks for the Characters of the Bible study, or a walk through the Bible. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you in the next one.